Well, yes, research. We all talk about it, but what does it actually mean? That we've been working on for 4 or 5 years, or practically ever since I've been here, and I realized that there were more and more drawbacks, both for you and me. Lines of research that were very closely interrelated, but that never added up to a coherent body of work, that had no continuity. Fragments of research, none of which was completed and none of which was followed through. Bits and pieces of research. And at the same time, it was getting very repetitive, always falling into the same rut, the same themes, the same concepts. A few remarks on the history of penal procedure, a few chapters on the evolution, the institutionalization of psychiatry in the 19th century, considerations on sophistry or Greek coins, an outline history of sexuality, or at least a history of knowledge about sexuality based on 17th century confessional practices, or controls on infantile sexuality in the 18th and 19th centuries, pinpointing the genesis of a theory and knowledge of anomalies and all of the related techniques. We are making no progress, and it's all leading nowhere. It's all repetitive, and it doesn't add up. Basically, we keep saying the same thing, and there again, perhaps we're not saying anything at all. It's all getting into something of an inextricable tangle, and it's getting us nowhere, as they say. I could tell you that these things were trails to be followed, that it didn't matter where they led, or even that the one thing that did matter was that they didn't lead anywhere, or at least not in some predetermined direction. I could say they were like an outline for something. It's up to you to go on with them or to go off on a tangent, and it's up to me to pursue them or give them a different configuration, and then we, you or I, could see what could be done with these fragments. I felt a bit like a sperm whale that breaks the surface of the water, makes a little splash, and lets you believe, makes you believe, or want to believe, that down there where it can't be seen, down there where it is neither seen nor monitored by anyone, it is following a deep, coherent, and premeditated trajectory. That was how Foucault described his work, or at least his lectures, at the Collège de France. In 1976, January, the opening lectures for the year which became known as Society Must Be Defended. Daniel Boyarin described Foucault's work on Christianity from the early 80s as a field left fallow for others to till. We could also say that any serious work on Michel Foucault is an archaeology, not only following Foucault's own archaeology of modernity, but also an archaeology of just what Foucault was doing with his archaeologies. This quote about the lines of unrelated, incoherent research, fragments of research, is even more prescient or ironic or funny, given that this was a turning point from 5 years of research that was well represented from the lectures into fully published book-length works, Discipline and Punish and the History of Sexuality, Volume 1. As Foucault talked about these unfinished pieces, he was about to begin 3 years of lecturing that would never come to fruition in a published book. Lectures on the state, really, governmentality. Some people talk about it as biopolitics from 76. Society must be defended, security, territory, population, with a year in between, and then neoliberalism or libertarianism. This was never turned into a book, these three. Foucault turned to antiquity, and this work on antiquity, although there's much more in the lectures, this early 80s work on antiquity, History of Sexuality, Book 2 and 3, 4, largely brought to completion what was in the lectures from 80 to 83. 83 to 84, this was another loose end, or a loose end that ties back to this missing 3 years, or this 3 years of lectures that were missing from the bookwork. Somewhat astounding theme that links these missing three and the final Courage of Truth is the theme of the legacy of philosophy. Not necessarily philosophy, but the true legacy of philosophy as war, and the legacy of history as war. Politics as a continuation of war by other means. A war against norms. At least in the Courage of Truth. The cynic war against, not all norms perhaps, but arbitrary, conventional norms. So, kind of where I'm going. Normalization in modernity was a foregrounded theme in most of Foucault's work. Specifically comes out most clearly in Discipline and Punish and the lectures leading up to that, where the delinquent, the abnormal, is used in order to normalize as the negative example. And this is almost a more important function of apparatuses of modern punishment. The construction of the delinquent and the bad example. This is more important than any purported attempts to rehabilitate criminals, recompense the offended, the construction of the bad and the use of the bad in order to protect wealth and social power. This was key. This was obvious, but norms in the ancient world, in all of Foucault's discussions of Stoicism, not so much talk about the norm, and yet it becomes very important at the end. From the 1984 Courage of Truth final year, just trying to sketch out how Foucault's lectures fit into the Deleuzean Century. 1925, January, Deleuze's birthday, to 2025, coming up, the end of the Deleuzean Century. At least the earliest possible Deleuzean Century. We could go on, maybe other optional Deleuzean centuries out there. Deleuzean centuries to come. So that's our moment. Foucault's been gone for 40 years. We're in the last 6 months of the Kingdom of Dead Ends. We're in the last 6 months of the Deleuzean Century. Fascinating theme. Again, this legacy of philosophy as a war. This theme of war was an alternative to sovereignty as a core concept of political reality, I guess. Power without the king. So you're going to have war, you're going to have norms, you're going to do power without the king. Ironically, though, it's the cynic philosopher who's the hidden king. In all this war against convention, also the care of the self, these two themes are repurposed by Christianity. This is the major process that Foucault's 80s work documents. How were these arts of philosophy repurposed for the sake of obedience to not merely God, but the institution of the church and the pastoral power? And then you go on, this pastoral power gets repurposed in modernity from doctor of the church to doctor of medicine, but also in many themes of political leadership where authority and obedience are the central fact, like in Reason of State. And then Reason of State carried on to modernity and fascism, especially fascism. But the solution to that, Foucault gives hints that it was actually neoliberalism and capitalism that was offering the best alternative to fascism, at least in 1978. What happened to those as they became ideologies? And hey, Foucault was not a fan of ideology. It wasn't important. Ideology merely rationalizes norms. But the process that constructs the norms, whether that be this kind of confession, this kind of construction of truth, truth is different from ideology. Ideology and belief, at least the kind of belief in facts or dogma, this was swept away by Foucault as he swept away Weber. He swept away Weber. He swept away Weber. More on that in a moment. The point is, look, this whole war connection. Look, guys, look, everybody. The point is, you can do Biden impressions in videos about philosophy, and they sound just like your Trump impressions. That's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. Don't think about it. This war versus sovereignty. This theme is also in Deleuze and Guattari. When you look at the 1970 lectures, which start the whole Collège de France lectures, you really get a sense that Foucault wanted to do his own Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Thousand Plateaus type of big book history. Was never able to do it. There would have been a whole lot of convergences with what Deleuze and Guattari did, such as this reevaluation of war, the true legacy of philosophy as a kind of intellectual war against conventions, against naive notions of sovereignty. What Foucault gives that Deleuze and Guattari didn't give is a kind of core Western axialization, this dense analysis of post-Socratic philosophy and how that gets taken up into Christianity, not merely as the ideology of Platonism, but as these different techniques that were made to be liberating, but became actually obedience-oriented, submissive. On the other hand, what Deleuze and Guattari offer, in contrast to Foucault, they're an entryway into big history. How can you take that Mediterranean axialization, connecting these techniques of philosophy that became Christianity, and relating them to the earlier archaic societies, from which deities, technologies, so much of this melting pot of Hellenistic Greco-Roman society took and transformed it. I think we can say that the origins of the state form or civilization was never really of interest to Foucault. evolutionary psychology, all of those things that we have today. Big history in its study of early civilizations and archaic religion. And that didn't seem to move Foucault. He really kind of stopped at the Greeks. And so the problem then, however robust this model of Hellenic Christian axiality and its legacy in modernity, you have this one problem on the left side of the equation, where Greek society was produced out of crisis. It was a melting pot, and Nietzsche understood this. Birth of tragedy, its hybridity, Eastern Dionysianism plus apparently native, but probably not native, Apollonianism creates this new alloy of a society. But it's this hybridity, a marketplace of ideas and religions. Out of that comes tragedy that documents the crisis, and philosophy, which negotiates the crisis and creates a new subjectivity. In Foucault's struggle to read Oedipus, you get this more than anything. I mean, Foucault and Deleuze were clearly in agreement. Oedipus in the Freudian sense of this is the model for the childhood genesis of personality. No, it's actually a model for the genesis of the West out of a crisis. Foucault didn't see that crisis. It's almost like the Greeks were set. Oedipus is a set for the Greeks and Greek justice or law or truth. What if we think instead of Oedipus as Sophocles' attempt to not to narrate, but to speak along with a crisis, the very crisis that produced a drama itself. Yes, a crisis in the politics of truth and sovereignty. These elements are all there in Foucault, but the idea that in the early cities, in the early civilizations, there was a stability of ritual establishing norms. They were based on hierarchy. They were based on divine kingship. When that starts, this is the failure. The king is coming from elsewhere. Does the king even belong? Do the gods even want the king to be there? What's left? Some strange mess of norms that then comes off and looks like a violation of these taboos. And tragedy is filled with people being disgraced. So Oedipus was a disgraced individual, disgraced sovereignty in the context of the decline of ritual. This is a chaotic moment, and some of Deleuze's writings really capture this chain of copies or simulacra where reality has gone into crisis. Failure to find the origin. Foucault documented how the church created traditions with techniques appropriated from philosophy. And that brings us up to modern statecraft, where the church declines in power as the state and bourgeois institutions rise in power, and you get another series of appropriations. When Deleuze looked at Foucault after Foucault's death in the book, in What is a Dispositif? And in Postscript on Societies of Control, there's the sense that, we were left with a certain subjectivity from the 19th century. The collapse of European colonies, the specter of fascism in World War II. We are entering a different stage. And on this, as much as Foucault talked about, he was writing a history of the present. The final stage was kind of left open. Care of the self. People looked at that and said, this is, we need to resurrect Stoicism. But Foucault, there's a couple points where he says, no, you can't do it. Not going to happen. But the self, it's so funny, Foucault was a psychologist, philosopher of psychology, at least in the early stages, from the 50s to Madness and Civilization. And then he kind of switched out and went after that Kantian career that was much broader than anything a history of psychology. But then it seems like he maybe lost touch with psychology or maybe this was the hidden part of the Septimius Severus ceiling in Foucault's own throne room as the secret king of philosophy. The self of the ancient times and the self of self-psychology, the narcissistic self. Character disorders have become really now an epidemic of narcissism. There was obviously people writing about this in Foucault's final decade, diagnosing the social epidemic of narcissism. Foucault mentioned narcissism in a strange place in Archaeology of Knowledge, where he wants to not see the subject through a narcissistic lens. He wants to strip that off. But is there a history of narcissism in Foucault's history of the subject? And here's where the Deleuzean Century, the end of the Deleuzean Century. Do you need Deleuze to help you finish Foucault? First, Oedipus. Oedipus is the beginnings of the narcissistic subject who replaces the sovereign by taking over the illusions of sovereignty onto oneself. There is now a new narcissism, which is anti-Parrhesiast, against telling the truth, and which, as Deleuze says about the narcissistic subject in Difference and Repetition, seeks the image of themselves, seeks to satisfy their own need for selfhood, with objects outside of themselves. So this may have a genesis in childhood, but it's also a social disorder. And Deleuze and Guattari were looking at schizophrenia as some kind of ideal. But it's really non-narcissism, which is the ideal they were looking for, because in this society after divine kingship, after the church's grasp on subjectivity, what's left is a narcissistic subject, struggling to find themselves. What Oedipus could not do is know himself. He didn't find his inner child. And that's the drama that started all the way back there at the decline of ritual. So to reinstall ritual, or to provide at least a surrogate for ritual in the dialogue between therapist and patient, and this is what self-psychology, post-Freudian self-psychology was trying to rediscover most of the newer strains of psychotherapy, in looking for the origins, the historical origins of the self. It seems like Foucault was trying to address the modern psychotherapy. And here at the end of the Deleuzean century, there is a very close relationship between the narcissistic subject and control. Image control. People doing image control for themselves while also submitting to control. In the wake of any kind of stable pastor, people aren't becoming their own pastor. I mean, that would kind of be a reversion to the care of the self. But instead, there's a participation in these social media where image control is the most important activity. And what people are most afraid of is the aleatory. Even in theory, what Agamben did when he disagrees with Foucault and says Foucault was wrong, that in the church there was no economia. I think Foucault's gripe with the church and the reason of state governmentality that came after was not that there was no economia, management of an economy of desires, money, and whatnot, but there was not an alethurgy. There wasn't an adequation to the aleatory. So, I mean, Agamben is glorious. The state of exception is basically he found the best thing in Aristotle, and then basically says it's from Schmidt, but the exception, laws cannot prescribe fully for all possible contingencies. Integrating contingency, being adequate to the aleatory, this was what Foucault saw in so much of the biopolitics of neoliberalism as an answer, as a solution, if it was connected up with some kind of an ethic or some kind of education, some kind of psychotherapy that could make for a new subjectivity. The fact that we lost Foucault, well, I was only 4, but the fact that Foucault was lost for the last 40 years of the Deleuzean century hasn't put us in a good spot. I'm not sure who I mean by us, but Foucault, when he was dying, Daniel Defer, his partner, said that he was rereading Spinoza. And Foucault has only very few comments on Spinoza, in The Will to Know mainly. Mysterious comments. But in Deleuze's amazing book where he details Spinoza's treatment of infinity, it's funny, like Spinoza never talked about the aleatory specifically, or chance. He didn't deal with probability. Pascal, late predecessor, had discovered probability. But for Spinoza, probability, the chance, was always like, from an ethical perspective, it was always like an approach towards the infinity that is life and experience. Kant took that up in a sense. His subject was always going to be dealing with a life and experience beyond one's ability to comprehend, which was signaled in the sublime. Deleuze talked about expression. He kind of saves it all throughout this big long book where he's detailing all of the intricacies of Spinoza's way of tracing from infinity to the actual ethical subject. But the goal of ethics is to be an expression of God's will. And that requires a submission, not to any authority, not to any human authority, but to actually chance itself. Deleuze was the best at linking these Nietzschean and Spinozist themes, and it was also in Stoicism, being adequate to the aleatory, being willing to submit one's life to chance under the right circumstances. And this was something that earlier civilizations did with rituals of divination. But where that will find a place after all of these centuries where the major institutions were determined to suppress uncertainty or the aleatory. This is the question we're left with at the end of the Deleuzean century.